Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck by Mark Manson today. We got all the notes and highlights ready to go, so we can really pull out the wisdom without you having to read the whole thing.
Absolutely.
This book kind of turns everything upside down,
Mhm.
like how we think about happiness and success. And we're going to, explore how choosing what to care about can really lead to a good life.
Yeah, it's a very refreshing take. We're just bombarded constantly with these messages. Achieve more, be more, have more.
Yeah.
But this book, it dares to ask,
Mm-hmm.
like, what if we just cared less about all that stuff?
Right. And it starts by tackling this paradox of modern success.
Yeah.
Think about it. We have more material wealth, more opportunities, more access to information than ever before.
Right.
And yet so many of us feel stressed, anxious, and like we're just not enough. Have you ever felt that way? Like no matter how much you achieve, there's always something else you're supposed to be striving for.
That's what Manson calls the backwards law. The more we pursue these positive experiences, the more aware we become of what we don't have. And suddenly even our successes feel kind of lacking. It's like the grass is always greener.
Yeah. And that feeling of always chasing the greener grass, it can trap us in what Manson calls the feedback loop from hell.
Yeah.
He's talking about that cycle, where we get anxious about our anxiety, angry about being angry, basically getting stuck in this spiral of all these negative emotions. It's like we're not just experiencing the emotion, we're freaking out about the fact that we're experiencing it.
Oh, yeah. It's exhausting.
It's so exhausting.
That's where the idea of not giving a feck comes in.
Right.
And this is super important. He's not saying we should be apathetic or emotionless.
Yeah.
Or become like some robot. There are subtleties to this. This art, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a much more mindful approach to our emotions. And there are practical techniques that we can use to break free from that spiral. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT offers tools to help us recognize those unhelpful thought patterns.
Right.
And then choose more constructive responses.
Yeah, and Manson's concept of not giving a feck, it aligns really well with some of those CBT techniques. It's about recognizing that you actually have a choice in how you respond to those emotions. You don't have to just get swept away by them.
So how does Manson define not giving a feck in a way that doesn't mean we just become totally indifferent to everything?
Well, he breaks it down into 3 key subtleties. First, it's about being comfortable, being different. You're not always going to agree with everyone. You're not going to please everyone. And that's totally okay. In fact, it's a good thing. It means you're being true to yourself and your values.
Right. So it's not about being indifferent. It's about embracing your individuality. What about the second subtlety?
The second one is about focusing on what really matters. When you have something in your life, something truly meaningful, those smaller setbacks and annoyances, they just don't have the same power over you anymore. Like, imagine you're working on some project, something you're really passionate about, and then, suddenly a traffic jam or a spilled cup of coffee. They just don't seem like such a big deal anymore.
Yeah, because your energy is directed towards something bigger, something much more fulfilling. I get that. So what's the third subtle art?
Okay, so the third, and this one is kind of mind-bending, is recognizing that you're always choosing what to care about. Even if you're not doing it consciously, we're just bombarded with so much information these days and stimuli every day that our brains are constantly filtering and prioritizing.
Right. We're kind of creating our own realities by choosing what we focus on. And that brings us to one of Manson's most memorable anecdotes, the story of the old lady who completely loses it over a 30-cent coupon at the grocery store. I mean, it's almost comical. But it really highlights how our values and priorities can shift dramatically depending on our circumstances.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, what's your 30-cent coupon? What seemingly insignificant things are you giving undue weight to in your own life?
It's a really good question to reflect on. And it leads us to the next big idea, choosing your struggles. Manson argues that happiness comes from overcoming problems, not avoiding them. We actually need challenges to grow and feel fulfilled.
Yeah, he compares it to the experience of running a marathon.
Versus
eating an entire cake. So the marathon's hard. It takes a lot of discipline and dedication. But the sense of accomplishment is immense. The cake might offer that instant gratification, but the pleasure is fleeting and ultimately less fulfilling.
Right. It's about the difference between choosing a struggle that aligns with our values and chasing that fleeting pleasure that ultimately leaves us feeling empty. And that brings us to this concept of values themselves and how they shape our choices and our experiences.
Remember Manson?
Yeah.
He encourages us to really examine our values and ask ourselves, are they really serving us? Or are they holding us back? Are we just chasing external validation? Or are we striving for something deeper, something more meaningful? And he uses a great example to illustrate this, the contrasting stories of Dave Mustaine and Pete Best. Two musicians with very different paths to,
Well,
I wouldn't say success, but certainly to different outcomes.
right. So you've got Mustaine, former guitarist for Metallica, achieves massive success with his band Megadeth, but he's still fixated on the fact that he wasn't in Metallica. He's constantly comparing himself to others, always seeking that external validation. But then you have Pete Best, who got kicked out of the Beatles right before they hit it big, but finds happiness in a simpler life, focusing on family and his own musical pursuits.
Right.
Right.
It really highlights how external success doesn't guarantee happiness.
Yeah.
And that sometimes, choosing to let go of certain values, can actually lead to a more fulfilling life.
So it's about defining what success means to you, not what society tells you it should mean. And that can be a really powerful shift in perspective. But it requires us to confront this idea, this mind-blowing idea, that we are constantly constructing our own realities, and we're often wrong about
Rob,
everything.
yeah, we like to think we're rational
Yeah.
and objective, but the reality is our brains are actually wired to confirm what we already believe, even if those beliefs are completely wrong. It's called confirmation bias, and it can lead us down some pretty dangerous paths.
Manson uses the story of Meredith Marin, the journalist who falsely accused her father of sexual abuse, based on these repressed memories, to illustrate how easily our perceptions can be distorted. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of clinging too tightly to our beliefs, especially when those beliefs are based on incomplete or unreliable information. So how do we break free from this tendency to cling to certainty, even when it might be totally misplaced?
That's where the power of saying no comes in.
Yeah.
It's about setting boundaries
Yeah.
and defining,
Yeah.
what we're willing to tolerate and what we're not. It's about prioritizing our values and having the courage to reject
Right.
those things that don't align with them, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's interesting how different cultures approach this idea of saying no. I remember when I was living in Latin America, I was really struck by how people there were so much more direct and comfortable saying no without feeling the need to sugarcoat it.
Right, it's refreshing.
Yeah.
In a lot of Western cultures, we're kind of conditioned to avoid confrontation,
Yeah.
and just be agreeable, even if it means compromising our own needs and values.
Yeah.
But in cultures where directness is valued, saying no is seen as a sign of respect
Yeah.
and honesty.
Yeah. It's about setting clear expectations
Yeah.
and avoiding misunderstandings. I think there's a lot we can learn from that. But saying no, it can be tough, especially when we're so used to trying to please everyone.
It's true. And Manson argues that this constant striving for acceptance can actually make us weak and prevent us from standing for anything. It's like we're so busy trying to fit in that we lose sight of who we are and what we really care about.
So how do we break free from that? How do we develop that courage to say no and start living a life that's more aligned with our values?
It starts with taking radical responsibility for our lives.
Yeah.
I know that phrase can sound a bit intense, but it's really about recognizing that we actually have the power to choose how we respond to the things that happen to us.
Right. It's easy to blame, external circumstances or other people for our problems. But Manson argues that true empowerment comes from owning our choices and their consequences, no matter how uncomfortable that might be.
Yeah. He uses the example of William James, this brilliant philosopher and psychologist who, despite facing, a lifetime of physical and mental health challenges, achieved some extraordinary, he could have easily succumbed to those challenges
Yeah.
and become bitter and resentful. But he chose to embrace his struggles and find meaning in them.
Yeah. Instead of viewing his limitations as something to be ashamed of, he saw them as opportunities for growth and learning. It's a powerful reframe.
It is, and it's a principle that applies to all of us, whether it's a difficult childhood, a chronic illness, or a string of bad relationships. The key is to take ownership of our experiences and choose how we respond to them.
But isn't there a danger in taking this radical responsibility too far? What about situations where we are legitimately victims of circumstance or other people's actions?
That's a valid concern, and Manson addresses it directly. It's not about denying that bad things happen or that we're sometimes treated unfairly. It's about recognizing that even in those situations, we still have a choice in how we interpret those events and how we move forward.
So it's not about blaming ourselves for everything, but rather focusing on what we can control, our attitudes, our choices, and our actions.
Exactly. And this principle,
Yeah.
it extends even to
Yeah.
the realm of politics,
Yeah.
where it's so easy to get caught up in the blame game. Manson argues that both the left and the right have fallen into this trap of just blaming the other side for everything and refusing to take responsibility
Yeah.
for their own shortcomings.
Yeah, it's that us versus them mentality that's become so prevalent, where everyone feels justified in their anger and resentment, and it just leads to this breakdown in civil discourse and cooperation.
Exactly.
So how do we shift from this blame-oriented mindset to one of radical responsibility, both in our personal lives and in the larger social and political context?
Well, I think it starts with self-awareness, which Manson describes, using this analogy of a self-awareness onion.
Oh yeah, the self-awareness onion.
Love that.
Love that analogy.
That's a great way to visualize, the different layers of self-understanding.
Right.
So the first layer is simply being aware of our emotions, being able to recognize when we're feeling happy, sad, angry, etc. Sounds basic, but so many of us try to suppress or ignore our emotions, especially the negative ones.
Yeah, it's true.
And that's where a lot of our problems start.
Yeah.
We can't really deal with something if we're not even willing to acknowledge that it exists. So that first layer is all about developing emotional literacy.
So once we can identify those surface level emotions, what's the next layer of the onion?
So the next layer, asking ourselves why we're feeling those emotions. And this requires us to dig a little deeper. And often involves uncovering, some painful or uncomfortable truths about ourselves. So for example, if you're feeling angry, is it because you feel threatened or inadequate? If you're feeling anxious, is it because you're afraid of failure or rejection?
It's about understanding the root causes of our emotions, which can be challenging, but ultimately very liberating. And then there's that third layer, the one that really makes us cry, our values,
Ooh.
our personal values.
Yeah, this is where we get to the core of who we are and what really drives our choices. Why do we consider something to be a success or a failure? By what standard are we judging ourselves and everyone around us?
Yeah, this is where the real work of self-transformation begins. It's about examining those underlying beliefs and assumptions that shape our perceptions and our choices. And it's about asking ourselves if those beliefs are serving us or holding us back.
Right. And that leads us to another important idea from the book, redefining good and bad values. Manson challenges a lot of these conventional notions about what constitutes success and happiness, arguing that many of the values that we strive for are actually quite shallow and ultimately unsatisfying.
So what makes a value good or bad, according to Manson?
Good values, they tend to be reality-based, socially constructive, and within our control. There are things like honesty, integrity, kindness, hard work. Bad values, on the other hand, they're often based on external factors that we can't control, like other people's opinions, or fleeting pleasures, things like popularity, status, material possessions.
And he uses a great example to illustrate this contrast between pleasure and struggle. Most of us would agree that pleasure is a good thing. But Manson argues that solely focusing on pleasure is a recipe for disappointment. True happiness, he says, comes from choosing our struggles wisely.
Yeah, it's like that marathon analogy again. We need challenges and obstacles to grow and feel fulfilled. And when we choose our struggles based on our values, we're more likely to find, meaning and purpose in our lives, even when things get tough.
Right.
He uses the story of Admiral Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War, to illustrate this. He endured horrific torture and uncertainty for over 7 years, but he emerged from that experience with his spirit intact.
Wow.
And he credits his survival to his ability to accept his reality and find meaning in his suffering. He focused on what he could control, his attitude, his inner strength, and his commitment to his fellow prisoners.
So even in the most horrific circumstances, choosing the right struggle can make all the difference.
Yeah. But Manson also contrasts Stockdale's story with the less inspiring group, the optimists. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't optimism a good thing? And it can be, but Manson argues that blind optimism, the kind that refuses to acknowledge reality, can actually be harmful. And in Stockdale's experience, the prisoners who clung to the belief that they would be released by Christmas and then Easter and then the next holiday, they were the ones who suffered the most.
Right, because their hopes were constantly being dashed, and they weren't mentally prepared for the reality of their situation. They were choosing the wrong struggle, clinging to this false hope that ultimately made their suffering worse.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the importance of saying no, not just to external demands, but also to those internal narratives that might be holding us back.
So saying no is about more than just setting boundaries with other people. It's also about setting boundaries with ourselves, with our own limiting beliefs. and
Yeah.
self-sabotaging behaviors. It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose what we give a feck about and what we let go of.
And that leads us to what Manson called the do something principle. It's this idea that action often comes before motivation. Like we tend to wait for that perfect moment or the perfect feeling. But the reality is, taking even those small steps can create the momentum we need to make real change.
He tells this great story about this novelist who forced himself to write 200 crappy words every single day, no matter what, regardless of how he felt. And guess what? It worked. He ended up writing like over 70 novels.
Wow.
So it's not about waiting for inspiration to strike. It's about just showing up and doing the work, even when you don't feel like it.
Right. And this principle, it
Yeah.
applies to all areas of our lives. If you want to improve your relationships, make an effort to listen more attentively to someone you care about.
Yeah.
If you want to be healthier, start by taking a walk around the block. Just do something.
Yeah. Break down those big, overwhelming goals
Mhm.
into smaller, more manageable steps. And those small steps, they can lead to big changes over time.
They really can. And this ties in beautifully with another important concept in the book, embracing uncertainty. We live in this culture that's obsessed with certainty, always trying to predict and control everything. But the reality is, life is full of surprises, both good and bad.
Right.
And the more we cling to those illusions of certainty, the more anxious and fearful we become.
Yeah. Manson uses the story of Hiru Onoda, the Japanese soldier who refused to surrender for almost 30 years after World War II ended, to illustrate this point. So
Yeah.
Onoda was stationed on this remote island in the Philippines, and he was absolutely convinced that the surrender announcements were enemy propaganda.
Wow.
He spent 3 decades living in fear and isolation, all because he refused to accept that the war was over.
It's a powerful example
Yeah.
of our beliefs, even when they're based on outdated or inaccurate information, can shape our reality.
So how do we break free from this fear of uncertainty?
Manson suggests we start by asking ourselves this very simple question: what if I'm wrong?
It's about poking holes in our armor of certainty and opening ourselves up to new possibilities.
Exactly. And then he challenges us to go even further, to consider
Right.
what it would mean if we were wrong. Like, what would the implications be for our beliefs,
Yeah.
our actions, and our relationships?
It's about being willing to question everything, even our most deeply held beliefs.
Totally. And finally, he asks us to consider whether being wrong would actually create a better problem than our current problem. Sometimes admitting that we're wrong can lead to more positive outcomes. It can help us break free from these unhealthy patterns, improve our relationships, and open ourselves up to new experiences.
Yeah. It's about choosing the right kind of wrongness, the kind that leads to growth and learning.
Exactly. And that brings us to the book's final and perhaps more profound value, contemplating our own mortality.
I know it might seem like a morbid topic, but Manson argues that facing our limited time on Earth can actually be this source of liberation and meaning, It's about recognizing that our time is precious and we shouldn't waste it on things that don't truly matter.
Right. Death has a way of really putting things into perspective. It reminds us that we're all going to die and that this life is a gift.
I remember after a close friend of mine passed away, unexpectedly. It was a real wake-up call for me. It made me realize how much time I was wasting on things that didn't align with my values. And it gave me the courage to pursue the things that did.
It's a powerful reminder
Yeah.
that we don't have an unlimited amount of time.
How do we apply this awareness of our mortality to our daily lives?
Manson suggests we use it as a motivator to live a more meaningful life, to focus on our relationships, our passions, and our contributions to the world, to let go of the petty dramas, the endless pursuit of more, and the fear of being wrong.
Right. It's about choosing our struggles wisely, embracing uncertainty, and living a life that's true to ourselves, even in the face of our inevitable mortality. And he concludes the book with this beautiful quote from the poet Charles Bukowski. He says, "We're all gonna die, all of us. What a circus. That alone should make us love each other, but it doesn't. We are terrorized and flattened by trivialities. We are eaten up by nothing."
Wow.
It's this reminder to really savor this one precious life we have and to make it count. So there you have it, a deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck. We explored how choosing our struggles, embracing uncertainty, and even contemplating our own mortality can help us live a more fulfilling life.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose what we give a feck about.
Yeah.
And to create a life that's meaningful to us.
And if this deep dive has sparked some big questions for you, that's fantastic. That's what this is all about. So until next time, keep exploring, Keep questioning and keep choosing what you give a feck about.